So this is a burgeoning area. And also, there is reason to believe that debt is increasing in the U.S. Between 2004 and 2021, household debt climbed from 8 trillion to 15 trillion. About 77% of households in the U.S. report holding debt. Although not all of that is harmful debt, these high numbers show that there's a potential to impact a vast number of Americans' health. Now, to some, it might seem like these links must be explained through poverty, right? So we have a financial system that might exacerbate poverty and lead to health impacts. But I want to submit to you that the story is not quite that simple. Debt actually is a better predictor of health than poverty, which is surprising to some. And if you really think about it, debt is distinct from poverty. Debt is a legal instrument that can entrap people in legal proceedings and place them in further debt and deprive them of basic needs and freedoms. So, for example, consider that landlords frequently check prospective tenants' credit histories. Public housing authorities often count debt as a strike on housing applications. Recent research has identified financial corporations bringing indebted people to court in what has been called assembly line litigation. These largely rubber-stamped cases doubled from 1993 to 2013 and now represent up to a third of all lawsuits brought in many U.S. jurisdictions. Most of these cases end in default judgments, which can allow financial companies to garnish wages, repossess cars, and foreclose on homes, thus impairing access to transportation and housing. And of course, when somebody does not appear in court to defend against a debt collection action, there can sometimes be a civil arrest warrant, which is something that courts actually do sometimes issue. And certain types of debt, especially criminal fines and fees, can land individuals in modern debtor's prison. So here we see the interrelating systems. We see our financial system implicating housing, transportation, the ability to travel and work, all important determinants of health. So in making this introduction, I want to make one thing really clear. There's been a big distinction in the health world between public health and health care. Of course, both are very important, but often we emphasize health care. Yet processes like foreclosure, eviction, and incarceration, again, important determinants of health and associated with our financial system, operate in parallel with our healthcare system. Not all health is mediated through healthcare. Public health is about the health of the population, and some people suffer health problems regardless of their experiences with healthcare. At the same time, healthcare is a key way in which Americans interact with health. And today, we actually have some of the leading experts in the interactions between our financial system with healthcare. And so this is a great moment to zoom in on especially the impacts of healthcare on people's lives. Now, most would agree that if someone's suffering from an illness, they should be able to seek the aid of a physician. But have we built a financial system and a healthcare system that allow people to access the care that they need? How does consumer finance interact with modern medicine? These are sprawling questions that make me thrilled to be here today with this panel. So without further ado, please let me introduce our really amazing panelists. So first, on the far side, we have Julie Morgan. Julie Morgan serves as Associate Director for Research, Monitoring and Regulations at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. She previously served as a Senior Advisor to the Director and established CFPB's Office of Policy Planning and Strategy. Julie joined the CFPB from the Department of Education, where she served as Acting Undersecretary and Deputy Undersecretary and developed several major changes to the federal student loan program. Julie has extensive experience managing and conducting research and policy across a variety of economic and domestic policy disciplines, including housing, healthcare, education, and economic mobility. She also has substantial experience in government lending programs, including oversight of origination, servicing, credit reporting, and collections policies, as well as considerable experience in research and regulations. That's Julie. On my left, we have Erin Duffy. Erin Duffy is a research scientist and the Director of Research Training at the USC Schaeffer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Duffy is the author of over 50 peer-reviewed articles, reports, and commentaries, and her research has been published in leading medical and health policy journals. Sorry, lost where I was. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, National Public Radio, and other media. Her research explores cost drivers, market failures, and patients' financial liability in the American healthcare system. Duffy's current work explores how uninsured and underinsured patients navigate shopping for healthcare services and receiving medical bills. Her past work measured the prevalence and magnitude of surprise medical bills. She has also conducted quantitative and qualitative research on health systems performance, healthcare provider payment, and socioeconomic and racial disparities in health outcomes. Duffy earned a PhD in policy analysis from Pardee Rand Graduate School, an MPH in biostatistics and epidemiology from Boston University. Go BU, I went there as well. And then in the middle, we have Eli Rushbanks, who is an attorney who works at the intersection of medical debt and consumer protection. He currently is the General Counsel and Director of Policy and Advocacy at $4, a patient advocacy nonprofit that helps patients apply for hospital financial assistance. In that capacity, he works with patients, advocacy groups, lawyers, state and federal regulators, and hospital leaders to improve patient access to and experience with financial assistance. He helped build $4 from the ground up, which so far has helped relieve over $60 million in debt for nearly 20,000 patients. His work has been featured in publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and NPR. His reports on charity care policy have been cited by the CFPB and have been the basis for class action lawsuits for charity care violations. So please, a round of applause for our panelists. All right, so to begin, why don't we start talking about a really important determinant of health, and that's access to healthcare. Before people even seek healthcare, they may face barriers to care that prevent them from getting what they need. So the first question is, how do these barriers operate? How does consumer finance affect healthcare access? Eli, could you launch this one? Push once.
We good? Okay, we're good. So there are a lot of small reasons that affect access. Probably one of the bigger of the small reasons is a lack of certain specialties or just a lack of providers in general, especially in rural areas. Language barriers play a relatively significant role, but the primary driver of people not accessing the healthcare system is that the products that we have developed to pay for healthcare are completely broken. Private insurance is completely broken and government insurance is completely broken. And when I say completely broken, I mean that they don't cover the cost. And then the patient is left to pick up the bill. And when the patient is facing that, they choose to not go and engage with the healthcare system because they either can't afford to get in the door because they might have to prepay for a certain service, or they're afraid of the debt that they're going to be straddled with if they do go. When they don't go to the doctor, it's not surprising that they tend to get more sick. So I have some stats that I've pulled from, to my knowledge, what is the most recent survey that has looked at this, because this has been a trend that's Peterson Health Group and KFF have been tracking this for a while. To my knowledge, the most recent data was from a 2023 survey from the Commonwealth Fund, where they found that 64% of uninsured people reported delaying or skipping care or prescription medications because they were afraid of the cost. With the private insurance world, it was 29% of people who have employer-sponsored insurance, 37% of people who got their insurance from the individual marketplace. And on the government side, it's 39% of people who have Medicaid and 42% of people who have Medicare, which I think that's the stat that surprised me the most. I think that's the stat that surprises most people. They think that Medicare is like the gold standard. And if you have Medicare, you're just going to be covered. That's not the case. There's a bunch of new insurance products entering the marketplace, particularly in the Medicare Advantage space, that are not covering people adequately. They still require massive deductibles, massive out-of-pocket costs for these patients. And so that paints a pretty bleak picture that, you know, in the neighborhood of, depending on the group that you're in, a quarter to half of people are delaying care, not going to the doctor. And I should tack on that 56% of the people on average who reported delaying going to the care reported that their condition got worse. So this is a snowball effect. This is taxing the healthcare system because we're not helping these people from a public health perspective on the front end, and it's making these conditions worse and more expensive on the back end. So the last point I'll say is I drilled down a little bit more in prepping to comment on this, and I looked at Oregon numbers specifically, because Oregon is a pretty well covered state. The average uninsured rate is like 7.2% right now, I think, federally, and Oregon has an uninsured rate of 4.6%, so very, very low compared to the national average. And it's had Medicaid expansion for a very long time. It's got a robust individual marketplace, pretty good state overall as far as coverage goes. And in Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority reported that plan premiums have increased 32 to 36% since 2013, but 2 in 5 people are still considered underinsured. Which means that the Oregon Health Authority defines those people as someone whose insurance wouldn't cover their cost of care if they needed to use it. And 10% of Oregonians reported not being able to pay for basic necessities because of medical bills. So this is not a situation where, like the non-Medicaid expansion states or maybe some states in the South, are disproportionately pulling these numbers up. Even in states where there's really good coverage, this is a problem. These insurance products that we have and the government pay products that we have just don't cover the costs. People get straddled with the bills, and because they're afraid of that happening, they don't go to the doctor.
May I jump in with a deeper dive on insurance design? Can folks hear me okay? Great. Eli, I really like how you touched on this issue of insurance design. And I want to add more detail about the commercial insurance market. So the ACA introduced a lot of reforms that really have reduced the number of people in the United States that are uninsured. And yet we still see growth in medical debt. And part of that, I believe, is related to insurance design. So with the post-ACA era, we've seen an influx of high deductible health plans where people have to pay large sums out of pocket before their insurance kicks in. And many studies have shown that this leads people to reduce all care, not just low value care. And so this circles back to the initial prompt around access, right? That people are self-selecting out of accessing care that they need, often because of the financial barriers of a deductible. High deductibles are also structured on an annual basis. And so often you're meeting your whole deductible in the first instance of using healthcare. And so you're getting a large bill all at the same time, or a series of bills that are still all at the same time. And most households juggle their budget on a week-to-week or a month-to-month basis. And so in economic terms, we talk about consumption smoothing. And it's really hard for a family to absorb a bill that's thousands of dollars all at once. And deductible insurance design has really caused so many households to face that exact financial dilemma. And that's where we end up with more of patients turning to loans, patients turning to financial products to try to then smooth out their deductible payments. And so we certainly have a problem with uninsurance still. We have a lot of racial disparity in uninsurance rates in the United States. We need to address that. But even within the population that has commercial insurance through an employer, we're seeing struggles with affording medical debt. And a lot of that does have to do with deductible insurance design and folks facing large bills all at once. A recent Kaiser Family Foundation employer survey also showed that about a quarter of employers are concerned that their employees can't afford the out-of-pocket cost sharing on the plans that the employer has provided to them. And so this is really a widespread issue that's even being recognized on the employer side. And I think there's a real need for us to be looking hard at both the regulatory environment, but also the roles of employers in changing the health insurance structures.
Yeah, I think you all covered this question really well. I'd just add, in addition to, the challenges created by high deductible health plans where people are incurring bills that they actually owe, CFPB's research has shown that a lot of people are incurring bills for debts that they actually don't owe at all, right? These are just straight up inaccurate medical debts that may be have been paid by a different party, including the insurer or the hospital, debts that should be paid by the insurer but haven't been, and debts that are just like completely inaccurate based on the services that were provided. And so I think when we talk about the effects on access, we have to bear in mind that people's access is being limited by debts that they have incurred and also debts that they should not owe at all.
Can I add on that, Julie? Yeah, so often when we think about medical bills, we think about a patient who's getting a bill from a hospital or a doctor's office, but there are so many mediators in the billing process between that hospital where the patient got care and the patient themselves, right? There's the people who do the billing and the coding, there's revenue cycle management groups, the insurers processing claims. There's a lot of space for data error, miscommunication, and issues, and it's at this point, for a lot of us, I think it's a black box. Where does the explanation of benefits come from? Where does the bill come from? Why don't they match? Why is the language different when we're opening our mail? And so really unpacking that, I think, within the research and regulatory communities and understanding who are these different actors that are in between the healthcare provider and the patient is really critical to thinking through what the policy levers are.
There's so much to unpack here, but when y'all mention this idea of an insurance product, sometimes you hear that people should buy a healthcare plan that works for them. So how would you respond to the argument that maybe these people are not buying the right healthcare plan and that they should buy something more robust?
I don't know that a lot of people have a lot of choice. These plans have gotten really expensive. The monthly premiums for plans on the individual marketplace can be pretty astronomical, and their options for what would be like a good plan with a good coverage are becoming more few and far between. High deductible plans are becoming more the norm. And then if you get your insurance from your employer, you don't really have any say in what they do. So I think there's a lot less choice that people have in the marketplace than we might think from the outside looking in.
Up to you. Do you want it or not?
I mean, I would just say, I think that's right. I think the idea that people are buying the healthcare that they can afford is a really important way to look at the question. I think especially based on the research that I was just talking about, I think my mind also goes to skepticism about whether or not people understand when they sign up what the hospital actually thinks they're providing, or whether the hospital is providing, the hospital and the health insurer providing the insurance that the person thinks that they're getting. I think we hear time and time again from people who had accidents or illnesses or other kind of catastrophic events that when they signed up for the plan, they thought should have been covered and quite reasonably thought should have been covered, and then end up with astronomical bills.
So what I'm hearing is that there are a number of determinants of access that intersect with our healthcare system, including fear of having to pay a lot of money. Maybe people do seek care and then they're hit with a bill and then they don't want to get further care. There are kind of multiple dynamics at play here. But surely once one does seek care, whether that's in an ED or maybe the person does take a risk to get some care, sometimes they are now saddled with healthcare debt. So can you explain how healthcare debt operates in our system? How in modern medicine does our financial system operate? What's the downstream impact? And maybe Julie, you could take this one.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'll turn on my microphone. I don't know, maybe we should just never turn them off. Our work suggests that this starts kind of from the time you walk in the door. So for a hospital or other healthcare provider, the way that you're going to pay for your care is basically the first way that you interact with a healthcare provider. And in many cases, in some cases that's about providing insurance information, but it's also about providing other mechanisms for the healthcare provider to be able to collect. And I think we're seeing more and more financialization within this system. CFPB has, when Director Chopra first came to CFPB, he started taking a close look at medical debt. And our first angle on that was the role of third-party debt collectors and debt that shows up on people's credit reports. And we found that there was a lot of debt showing up on credit reports that was inaccurate or dubious in some way. Debts are disputed on credit reports at 3 times the rate of credit card debt, and I think like 7 times the rate of student loan debt. And it's also not predictive of your ability or willingness to repay other types of debt. So, you know, we're kind of looking at it from this angle of the kind of traditional, like I think what people think of as the traditional system of accumulating healthcare debt, which is I go in, I either am uninsured and am incurring a bill, or I have insurance that covers some part of my care and I'm incurring a bill, and then that bill is either dealt with the provider or ends up in third-party collection. So that's certainly, I think, one of the more common ways that people are incurring debt. What we've found as we and other advocates and organizations and states have taken steps to address third-party debt collection and the role of credit reporting is that healthcare providers are seeking other ways to ensure that people pay off their bills. And that's creating it's kind of like increasing the prevalence of other types of medical debt that people may incur. So I think the best examples and the ones that we've been focusing on recently are installment loans and medical credit cards. So these are something that had traditionally been seen in what people think of as, I really hate the kind of, you know, the idea that it's optional care or things, you know, like as though going to the dentist is an optional kind of procedure, but have been showing up more on the side of things like dental care, veterinary. That's where these installment loans and credit card products sort of started, but we're seeing those merge into the more traditional hospital setting or primary care setting, where doctors are asking people to sign up for a card in order to make their payments. And those cards, in many cases, have higher interest rates than what someone would have on a general purpose card, and they may have these kind of deferred interest schemes that lure people in with a 0 or low interest rate, but jack up the payments over time. So that's another way that we see people incurring medical debt. The third, and I think one where we have some attention on this as like an emerging trend, is just requiring people to put down a credit card in order to get care at all. So you walk into an urgent care with a sick child and they say, absolutely, we'd love to see you. Give us your insurance information. By the way, also provide us with a credit card number. And, you know, within 10 or 12 or 15 days of settling with your insurance company, we're going to bill that credit card for the remainder of the balance. So people are incurring debt in an increasing number of ways for pursuit of healthcare. And I think for us, it's creating a number of different risks for people. And to Erin's point, it implicates an increasing number of players that are kind of intermediating the kind of basic structure of like, I got a service, I incurred a debt for it, and now I'm paying for it. When there's 3 or 4 different parties in the middle, it creates additional risks for consumers.
Julie, this is so interesting. And I just want to say one thing to reflect on, which is you're saying that these patients are often incurring debt, but couldn't you frame that as they're being given credit? And in fact, access to credit has been hailed as a really important tool for lifting people out of poverty or helping them buy important things like healthcare. How would you respond to this kind of buzzword of access to credit today?
So I think in many cases, people are not, in fact, being given access to credit. They are just trying to pay for a service, and a credit is being inserted into the middle of the process in a way that they have limited control and understanding over. I think particularly in the case of medical credit cards, I mean, I'm going to use like the most extreme example and not get into the details of like what is a credit product, but in the most extreme examples, we're seeing people who are going like a person who had a stroke and comes out the other end with a credit card. I would not say is a person who was like extended credit, right? they were lured into a product. And I think, I think there are a lot of ways to think about how to extend credit to people that is the safest and least expensive way for them to pay for medical debts that that may not be covered by insurance. But I think, my instinct in that kind of conversation is to push it back towards my co-panelists who have more expertise and probably like more of a platform to talk about, the broken pieces of our healthcare system overall that create those debts in the first place.
Up to you, Eli. Erin, do you want to, or next question?
I have, I guess, a couple additional things. I kind of like the button, actually. We kind of buzz in to talk. There are, as Julie said, a ton of errors in bills, which will add to this problem, obviously, because patients are getting billed for stuff they didn't receive. But the amounts that are being charged and what's being billed for is getting increasingly shady, for lack of a better term. There's been a bit of a trend of hospitals buying up urgent care facilities or physician practices even. And then because the hospital now owns that thing, tacking on a hospital facility fee, which can be $500-600 or more for just stepping foot into the facility, which I guess they can try to defend when it is a hospital, because those are much more expensive facilities to run, but it doesn't make any sense to attach that onto an urgent care facility or to a physician group practice just because it's not owned by a hospital. So there's things like that going on, which just are people getting bilked for things that for just wildly inflated costs. And then their charge master rates on average are about charge masters, they're set price lists. It gets very complicated because they'll give a different price to every insurance company, and if you're uninsured or cash pay or whatever. But the charge master is their starting kind of high price. If you just walk in and want to pay without some other deal cut, that's what you're going to get. That's what you're going to charge. These are about 500% on average of what it actually costs the hospital to deliver that service. And they will tell you when you talk to hospital executives that that's not actually an amount they expect anyone to pay, because that's their starting point when they enter into negotiations with insurance companies. But what happens is people fall through the cracks, especially uninsured folks, and they get charged those prices anyways. I mean, that's a common scenario that leads to like a bankruptcy event.
I actually want to say a few words. I've done a lot of research on cancer in the last few years, and you can tell a lot about a healthcare system based on the way that it treats people with a serious disease like cancer. It seems at first that we've actually done a really good thing for cancer patients because we have a suite of automatic coverage provisions. So when a cancer patient goes to the hospital, the drugs by law usually must be covered by law, although of course there's some discretion that insurers have to prioritize certain drugs. But actually what that does, and in particular because a lot of payers are barred from negotiating prices, is it creates really high prices for these cancer pharmaceuticals. And so then when you imagine that a patient has to pay for sometimes 10 or 20% of that drug, it can be a really high price. So the average list price for a new cancer drug right now is $278,000 annually, which is a tremendous amount of money that almost nobody can afford. And so people are often having to make like life or death decisions based on their finances. And in part, again, because we have this strange pharmaceutical market that puts so much money automatically into the drugs that pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to raise the price, even though it drastically impacts access. And then as a result of this, you have really high bankruptcy rates among people with cancer. So across different kinds of cancer, you see that at about like 7 to 8 to 9 years, about half of cancer patients reach the point of filing for bankruptcy. Half. That's a really huge amount. And then on top of that, you have the work of people like Melissa Jacoby, who writes about our bankruptcy system and who it's actually benefiting. So in her book, highly recommend the book, by the way, she points out that bankruptcy actually is not very good at resolving people's personal debts for people who are desperate to have some relief. But it is really good at protecting companies from liability. And so companies are increasingly turning to bankruptcy to resolve their tort liabilities. And interestingly, that is especially true for companies that are being held responsible for causing cancer. So we have Johnson & Johnson trying to use bankruptcy to resolve its debts over asbestos in its baby powder. And at the same time, we have patients who are saddled with healthcare debt from these really expensive cancer drugs and that can't get relief in a bankruptcy court often. And so, and not only that, you might be thinking, well, at least these drugs are providing a good benefit for this cost. Well, actually, there have been a number of studies on the benefits of cancer drugs. And not all cancer drugs even have a measured benefit, and that's a longer story about how FDA is no longer requiring a clinical benefit for cancer drugs that are approved. So that's a longer discussion. But for those where we do know the overall survival benefit for cancer drugs, the average is about 2 to 3 months gained. So you have these, and patients often aren't told about this because oncologists are hesitant to provide a definitive number. But on average, the amount of life gained is 2 to 3 months, and which is less than they would, according to surveys, accept in return for the toxicity that they're often subjected to from these drugs. And so this whole mess is essentially creating the system where cancer patients are saddled with debt due to drugs that are not very effective under this malfunctioning market where we're kind of incentivizing really high prices unnecessarily. So that's my end of my mini rant about cancer. But anyway, so why don't we move on to research? So the first step in addressing a problem is often to understand its scope and contours. So what would you all say about whether we understand the current scope of healthcare debt and the interaction of our financial system with our healthcare system? Do we know a lot about it? Are there a lot of holes in our understanding? And what are the barriers to research?
I can jump in on that if that's okay. I view medical debt as a symptom of a lot of structural and systemic problems that we have. And I think through national surveys, asking people how much debt they hold, we've gotten a good handle on the many ways that people can hold debt. So there's the debt we see on credit reports, but also money that we owe to friends and family, payment plans with or without interest that are structured with other third parties. And I think we have a good view of the symptom of the problem. But when we think about what policy levers we could use to mitigate medical debt, there's really a morass of state and federal jurisdictions and regulatory structures and a whole like commercial market side of insurance as well. And so for a policy analyst like me who wants to figure out, okay, what are my levers and where in the system can I work upstream to prevent medical debt? I want to know, like for everyone holding medical debt, what was their income, their household structure, their employment status, and what state were they in at the time that they originated, that debt originated? And I want to know who the healthcare provider was and whether that's a nonprofit entity or a for-profit entity. And I also need to know whether their insurance was a fully insured plan or a self-funded product. And that's a lot of information to have to know about one person's originated debt to figure out what cracks they fell through, right? Because there's so many seams and cracks in our insurance system and our regulatory environment. And so with all that information, then you can advocate on an individual basis to say, okay, well, was there a regulatory protection that wasn't enforced here? Or are you falling through some crack where we need to adapt policy and regulation or introduce new, market incentives or address something, right, to fix it? And that's a lot of data to have to try to, access it and figure out. And so, we end up doing more of a case study approach where we try to disentangle what's going on with individual people at that level of granularity, and then run these bigger surveys and look at credit reports and things like that to get a bigger picture. But it's really hard for me to wrap my hands around all of the magnitude and prevalence of each seam, and really disentangle where someone's fallen through a crack versus where there's been a failure of regulatory enforcement. So that's my, where I sit as a researcher. There's also a lot of data that's privately held that would be useful. So a lot of companies are holding data on their revenue cycle management. Hospitals and other healthcare providers they know what debt lines go out. They know what's written off as charity care versus bad debt. But there's not a lot of transparency about that. And so I really view this as a large system where we see the scope of the downstream problem, but we just have these little flashlights on pieces of the system that would allow us to really develop better regulatory protections.
And I'll turn my microphone on. Okay, so just a couple of areas that come to mind is one of the great things about my role at CFPB is that I have our Office of Research and then our market monitoring divisions under me. And so I get to kind of bombard them with questions about things. So just a few areas on medical debt that have been top of mind for me. I think one that is hard for us to get at is the role of general purpose credit cards and the kind of infiltration of medical debt into other areas of debt. We hear about this a lot in individual stories and complaints to us from consumers about the effects of their medical bills on their general purpose credit card debt and then on their ability to get a mortgage or an auto loan or things like that, or even their defaults on other types of debt. So that's something that we can get at through surveys, but it's a little bit harder than other areas. That's one. The role of these kind of third-party intermediaries, and particularly the interplay between those and consolidation, the role of private equity in healthcare, I think is really important for us to understand better, and particularly revenue cycle management. These companies that are, in some cases, acting both as a consultant on billing practices and as a third-party debt collector. I think that's a very ripe area to understand better. Another is how the different parties, particularly on the kind of debt accumulation side, play a role and what their incentives are. And I think here, particularly because policy on medical debt is a little bit bifurcated at the federal level between the regulators of the debt side, like the CFPB, and then the regulators or policymakers on the healthcare side, including HHS, CMS. I think it's really important to understand where the problems are arising. And so medical credit cards, I think, is a good example there, where the card issuers are creating arrangements with the healthcare providers. The healthcare providers are serving as the salespeople for those cards, and understanding both the contractual relationships there and then the incentives that creates, I think, is really important. And then just some of the benefits and opportunities in areas that relieve medical debt for people. So particularly financial assistance, we are seeing some really encouraging pushes at the state level to expand financial assistance policies to make those more real for people and to ensure that hospitals are actually offering people the charity care that they're supposed to be offering. So understanding how that is impacting people so that we can kind of troubleshoot there a little better. And then the benefits of relieving medical debt. I think there's been like one study on this and it was somewhat limited in terms of what it looked at. So really getting a little bit deeper there to understand what we can do to deal with both, the accumulation of debt, but also the outstanding burden of medical debt.
So Julie, why not launch studies on all these things and be done with all of them in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Is it the similar issues that Erin mentioned? And do you feel like you have extra powers as part of an agency?
So, we're a government agency, so we're somewhat limited in both our resources and our power. But from that list of topics, we're picking and choosing the places where we think we can have an impact on the research side. We do look at these questions through a variety of different data sources, which I think is maybe a benefit. We're able to look at consumer credit panel data to just really understand how medical debt is showing up on people's credit reports. We also field surveys that are linked to that credit panel data, so we can see kind of we can get information directly from survey participants that we wouldn't be able to see in the credit panel data. And then, we monitor markets as well. So we're looking at the changes in industry practice and talking to industry, and can kind of combine that with the research. And I think that is quite helpful. I think, it's always my frustration on the research side is time, right? There's like whatever, $220 billion in outstanding medical debt, and, waiting 2 years to get the answers seems too long. So we're sort of focusing on the pieces that we can do in the short term while also seeding that longer term research.
Well, to the extent that you create new data sets for Erin, I'm sure she would be grateful. One of the biggest things that FDA did when it was regulating tobacco was to create the standardized National Youth Tobacco Survey, which is done annually and is very standardized and kind of serves as a base level of tobacco knowledge for policymakers and lawmakers. Okay, so policy and law-wise, we do have policies and laws that govern consumer finance, including in the health space. So why do we have problems with medical debt, right? Where are the federal statutes, the state statutes? We have the CFPB doing things, right? So why does the problem persist? To what extent are our laws protecting us? Where are the holes? Maybe Eli, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so if I zoom out like way more than 1,000 feet, I think about we do have some laws that are meant to provide a benefit to a patient or a protection from something to a patient. And the distribution channels of these things are largely through the providers themselves. And so I think about these things as the kind of on the front end, what are the problems with good faith actors implementing these programs? And on the back end, what are the problems with enforcement against bad faith actors? And on the front end, with implementation of these things, Erin touched on this earlier, they're immensely complex. When you walk into a hospital as a patient, or really any provider, what your rights are, what benefits you're eligible for, what protections you should receive, what price you're going to get are going to be, there's almost an unlimited number of variables that could affect that thing. Your age, your income status, your household size, the specific procedure or treatment that you're in for, all these things are going to affect what benefits you should be receiving and what protections you should be receiving. That is, my organization, the way that we operate, we work with charity care financial assistance laws, which big picture is an obligation of a hospital to give free or reduced care to low or middle income patients, depending on their percentage of the federal poverty level. And we advocate for charity care laws. We stay in our lane. We push for better laws. We don't look at Medicaid. We don't look at insurance stuff. We don't look at the bigger picture. And there's a ton of little cottage industry, groups pushing for policies in their lane, whether it's benefits for people for maternity services or for cancer treatment or something like that. And that's all great. And all of these things, when you look at them individually, it's like, who wouldn't want that? We should definitely be doing that. And we definitely should be doing that. But what it's led to is a real patchwork of our healthcare system is a real stitched together quilt of different benefits and different protections, and every single one has its own form, and every single one might have its own agency that's looking at it. And when you think about practically, these things are being administered through non-experts at a hospital level. They're administrative folks who applied for a job, went through a few-day training, and now there's a patient standing in front of them, and they're expected to get all of the benefits in their hands that they're entitled to. It's just a situation that is gonna lead to a ton of error, a ton of people falling through the cracks. A really good example of this in practice was at $4, we submit charity care applications for folks. We noticed a trend at one hospital in the East Coast where they're denying all of our applications for maternity services. When we approached the hospital to figure out what was going on, turns out that there was a mistaken belief within the financial assistance office that patients who were in for maternity services were not eligible for charity care. This mistake popped up because in that particular state, there was expanded Medicaid for maternity services. So a higher income threshold made you eligible for Medicaid if you were in for maternity services than any other treatment. So the kind of water cooler policy that developed at the financial assistance office was maternity services is a Medicaid thing and not a charity care thing. There's still a big gap between people ineligible for Medicaid and still needed help with their bill, and the hospital is supposed to be forgiving some of that through their charity care program. But this is just one small example of how the complexity of these things led to some telephone game mistake and a whole host of people not getting benefits that they should have been entitled to. And then on the back end of enforcing these laws that we do have, these policies that we do have against bad faith actors, I think the primary problem there is that these aren't consumer protection laws. They're basically accounting laws. Healthcare policy is very focused on entity regulation. So charity care is another really good example of that. It lives in the tax code at a federal level. It's a requirement that nonprofits have to have these charity care policies and give these benefits as part of the things they have to do to be a 501c3 nonprofit hospital. And because it's in the tax code, there's no private right of action. You can't class it under the False Claims Act. There's nothing a patient can really do to stand up and say, I was eligible for charity care hospital, you didn't give it to me, and bring some sort of claim or enforcement action against that. Even other agencies that might be federal agencies that might be motivated or want to do something in that space can't, because they don't have jurisdiction over that particular part of the code. When we think about consumer protection laws, they almost always come with a private right of action and a robust regulatory agency enforcement mechanism. And that's just not the case with most healthcare policies. They're basically rules for accountants to report how they are classifying certain types of revenue.
So can you just repeat the question one more time? I was so busy listening to Eli's answer that I forgot exactly what
It was riveting.
Yeah.
But so where is law and policy? Where are the holes? Why do we still have problems with healthcare debt and with people accessing healthcare due to financial reasons when we have all of these legal frameworks that ostensibly protect against these problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm going to acknowledge and set aside the fact that one reason that we have these problems is because we have failures in our overall approach to healthcare, right? That system is broken. But just on the debt regulation side itself, I think that these industries respond to the signals that they're getting from their regulators. And, I think we saw that over time where there were no signals, we saw a lot of shenanigans. I think now that we're seeing both the CFPB, other federal regulators, and states, starting to take action on medical debt and ask questions, we're not only seeing the direct effect of those actions, but we're also seeing changes in industry practices that are just responsive to that kind of focus. So on credit reporting, the CFPB started digging into the role of medical debt on credit reporting, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. And we're now have a proposed rule to ban medical debt from credit reports. But we've also seen in the interim the credit reporting agencies take action to take certain debts off of credit reports voluntarily, which is obviously not enough. And there's still, 15 million people with medical debt on their credit reports. But we're seeing that kind of movement. And then similarly, when we start focusing on disputes of medical debt, we see third-party collectors being less likely to report overall because they don't want to deal with the disputes there. I think there are places where there are legitimate questions about there are still outstanding legitimate questions about compliance with existing laws on the books. We issued an advisory opinion recently about medical debt, and third-party debt collection. And, this is really covering sort of like the basics of what we think that debt collectors ought to be doing. So we're still seeing issues with, double billing, where you're getting billed for something that was also billed to your health insurer or was paid for by financial assistance or charity care, bills that surpass the limits under federal and state law, just straight up fake charges, debt that's being collected that can't be substantiated, and then misrepresentations to consumers about their rights through debt collection. So I think there's definitely more to be done just on the basic enforcement and compliance. And then, to Eli's point about financial assistance and the IRS, I think there are places where we need to take a really close look at whether or not, we're taking the right approach in terms of making sure that hospitals are have policies on the books and then are implementing their policies in a way that comports with what the intention of the regulation was. So where the CFPB sort of, I think of us as kind of like sitting like at the bottom of a lot of these problems, because we see it when the debts end up in collections, but there are these upstream problems that need to be resolved in order to, we can do what we can through our lens, but issues like the role of charity care policies and the role that hospitals are playing in implementing them are really important upstream effects on our work.
I'd love to describe some recent research I have that I think touches on this topic. So we have an increase in price transparency law at the federal level that's been rolled out over the last couple of years so that patients can see what the price of a service is. It's a small number of services. Some of them are things that you would plan in advance, like an orthopedic procedure. And the idea behind this was that we're in this consumer-directed healthcare paradigm where patients have some skin in the game with their deductible, and perhaps they'll be, smart shoppers, and they'll price compare, quality compare, and select a healthcare provider that works for them. That's the model that we're in currently. And there's this question of whether that is working, and I think the existence of medical debt would suggest it's very much not working. But beyond price transparency, I really believe we need to move towards affordability transparency. And affordability transparency, in my mind, is how much will you owe and when will you owe it? And what are the options for paying for it, including what are the interest rates and fees that would be tacked on? So you can access the price now, but you don't necessarily have access, through these price transparency laws to know whether you have to pay everything up front, whether you have to pay half up front, whether there's 90 days or you could set up a 3-year payment plan, whether there's interest associated with it, right? And so I conducted a study with a really great team of undergrads at USC where we were secret shoppers. We were underinsured, so we would call hospitals and say, I need a knee endoscopy. That's one of the procedures that is under price transparency, but I have a really high deductible. What are the options for me? Can I apply for financial aid even though I'm insured? Or do you have payment plans? And if so, how long are they? And do you charge interest? And also, do I have to pay before the procedure, or can I pay it out over time, or is some portion due? And so we were trying to simulate what's the administrative burden really of trying to figure out affordability. And what we learned, and this really builds on what Eli has said about the patient experience, is that there's 3 different offices at almost every hospital that you would need to talk to get all that information. So there's a financial aid office, and that's separate from the billing office that handles payment plans. And then it's admissions or scheduling that's going to tell you whether or not your copay or an estimate of your deductible is due on the day of your procedure. And so if you're a patient and you're trying to figure out how much am I going to owe, even for something that's planned, where in theory you should be able to shop around a little bit, it's really challenging. And my students got really good at it. They started to know what to ask. They talked to the financial aid office and they'd say, well, do you have payment plans? Can you transfer me to anyone who knows about payment plans? And they figured out how to, work the phone trees at hospitals. But many people don't know that you can call ahead, right? And don't know how to navigate these different offices. And, my perspective on this is that it's because hospitals aren't designed to receive a customer. they were designed with these separate isolated offices around tax code requirements and different regulatory things. And so now that we have an insurance design that, is predicated on the idea that patients are shoppers, we don't have providers that are designed in a way that would allow patients to do that. And, we could have a much longer discussion about whether or not, the information asymmetries and things like that in healthcare really ever make a patient a shopper. But in the paradigm that we're in, you can really kick the tires on this. Like, is affordability accessible, knowledge about affordability accessible in advance? And, the conclusions on our study is that it is, but it's really tricky to get that information. And it's a lot of leaving people voicemails, waiting for them to call you back to try to figure out how much you would owe. So even with price transparency and even with charity care regulation, the administrative burden on patients is really high.
What really strikes me, Erin, and from the others, is that you really see the elements of healthcare becoming a little bit more corporate, a little bit more marketized. And with that, some of the problems that we've seen in the financial system are kind of being imported into the healthcare system. So that's one theme that I've just picked up on. Before we go to our last panel question, I just want to say we have a system for y'all to ask questions to the panelists. So please go to slido.com and then enter the hashtag AI2Junk, and you can participate. There's nothing more delightful than having your question be asked. So I'm waiting for some good questions here. We've kind of already touched on this, but I think we could be more explicit. Where are we moving to in this space? Where do you see the future going? Do you think that we're going to be passing more laws, policies, maybe new regulations? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What do you see on the horizons? Maybe Julie, you could start.
Really, I think maybe by the time we get to audience questions, I'll get the microphone thing down. I think I'm optimistic about a lot of the changes that the CFPB has made or is, poised to put in place and the impact that those will have for people. I'm optimistic that we're having really good conversations about what financial assistance ought to look like and what it could look like, and about the movement that we're seeing at the state level as well. I think the thing that gives me some pause is that the incentives for the healthcare industry and the economics for the healthcare industry are challenging, and we can't just kind of rest on our laurels and be like, look, we took care of credit reporting, we've settled on an approach to financial assistance. We've got this covered, because I think what we're seeing even now with, what I described on the medical credit card side and on the use of credit cards in general in healthcare is that, people are going to find the ways to extract payment from consumers, and we need to sort of be incredibly vigilant about that overall. So I don't know that that's pessimistic, but it's sort of like a resolute, this is a problem that we're going to continue to deal with as long as people owe money for their healthcare. But I do think that there are some really low-hanging fruit to make improvements to that system, such that people don't feel duped every time they have an interaction with their healthcare provider. And so that, having either a chronic illness or some sort of catastrophic event doesn't become a catastrophic financial event for families as well.
So on the private sector side, one trend I've started to hear about is more hospitals using preemptive screening for financial assistance. So basically using a vendor that will process public information about a patient with a bill and determine based on public information about that person whether they're likely to be eligible for charity care, and then just apply the financial assistance for them and write that off as charity care versus moving it to bad debt. I think that's a positive trend. It's something right now that hospitals are doing voluntarily, I believe. I don't think that there's any regulatory requirements yet for them to use this, but it does relieve administrative burden for some patients. And I think shifting the the obligation to navigate the system from the sick patient into more automated systems is helpful. If we have time, I could talk about another study I did recently.
Yeah.
I surveyed a nationally representative sample of Americans, and I asked them whether they'd gotten a medical bill in the last year that they either couldn't afford or there was some other problem with. And about 1 in 5 people said yes, they had. And then I asked them, well, did you call the billing office? Did you reach out to try to address your problem? And only 3 in 5 people did reach out to the billing office to try to address the problem. The 40% of people who didn't reach out, 85% of them said that they did not think it would make a difference, and that was why they didn't call. For those who did reach out to the billing office and make that call, most of them got some sort of financial relief, or they got an error corrected on the bill. Like, that advocacy was effective. And the factors that predicted whether or not someone made the call or didn't when they had that bill in front of them, some of it was personality traits. So we had personality scores for people. More extroverted and less agreeable people were more likely to reach out to the billing office. And people with higher financial literacy and more education were more likely to advocate for themselves. And so we have this preferential access to financial relief for people who are, basically more informed and more equipped as consumers, and people who aren't afraid to pick up the phone. And that's not necessarily the equitable system that I think most of us would want. We would want financial relief to be available to everyone who's eligible based on income. And so I'm hopeful that moving towards some of these preemptive eligibility systems could be useful for a lot of patients.
Yeah, the things that are encouraging me right now are happening at a state level. Oregon, for example, has a relatively new law that requires hospitals to do a form of pre-screening for every patient, essentially. If they're going to have a bill that exceeds $500 or they're uninsured, they have to be pre-screened. A lot of hospitals are using these presumptive eligibility tools that Erin mentioned. Where those have maybe cracks or haven't been as productive for certain hospitals, we're trying to work with $4 is trying to work with the state to open up state tax data to verify people's incomes, to just take this burden off the hospitals. So there's stuff happening there that we're still working on it, but I'm encouraged. North Carolina just passed a new interesting Medicaid rule where they're going to buy a ton. Well, they're going to work with another nonprofit called Undo, formerly RIP Medical Debt, to buy a bunch of 10 years worth of medical debt from the hospitals if the hospitals commit to prevention of the accumulation of future medical debt, usually through expanded charity care financial assistance policies. So there's a lot of really good experimentation, I think, happening at a state level. And then I actually don't see a lot of blockers politically at a federal level if the states can kind of crack the code on this. Every study I've seen, this is an extraordinarily bipartisan issue. The polling numbers, Republican, Democrat, everybody in between, in large swaths think that a medical event shouldn't turn into a financial crisis, and that medical debt is something that the government should be involved with fixing. So there's an emerging environment that makes me optimistic, even though we have a pretty big problem on our hands right now.
All right, so it turns out I was on the wrong tab. So I went from concerned about not having questions to being overwhelmed that we have a lot of questions. So without further ado, so it sounds like the people want to learn more about private equity. So, and please upvote questions that you want to hear about, because that bumps it up on my screen. So can you discuss the impact of private equity's increased involvement in the medical system, i.e. purchasing medical facilities and practices?
I've done some work in this space. Just as background, so private equity is a particular type of financial investment. Maybe raise your hand if you know what private equity is, so that I don't waste time. I see a lot of hands, but maybe not all of them, so I'll do a quick. The typical goal of a private equity firm is to extract value in a really short period of time. So they're not making an acquisition to hold on to for 20 years. It's more like a 5-year timeline, and the goal is to buy an entity. It could be a healthcare practice, or it could be a concrete factory, or it could be anything, right? And within 5 years, be able to flip that for a large profit. And so the ways that you can extract profit in a short timeline really vary based on the type of healthcare entity that you're investing in, and depending on what the practice is and what those mechanisms for extracting value are, it may be bad for quality of care and may be bad for affordability of care. And so I've looked a lot at private equity involvement in hospital-based physician groups and emergency medicine in my work, and tried to understand what the model of value extraction is in outpatient practices as well. And it really looks different based on the specialty. There's different ways of basically, gaining profit within 5 years. But I think the basic premise is that there's higher spending on healthcare, and more of that is going to profit when you see this type of financial investment structure. And there's, I'd say, ongoing research about the impacts of private equity in different sectors, but some really concerning literature on the role within nursing homes and long-term care facilities. Some of my work shows increase in prices for emergency medicine, anesthesiology, and air ambulance services when there's a private equity investment-backed group involved in the service. So if you're trying to reduce the cost of healthcare, having third parties extracting revenue from the system is not going to help you achieve your goal. And there are those that argue it, that business people come in and they create efficiency and things like that as well. But I think overall we see that the cost of healthcare is increased when you have a private equity investment, with mixed reviews on any improvement to quality.
Thanks, Erin. Julie, Eli, want to say anything, or are you good?
No, I would just echo a lot of what Erin is saying is the same thing that we've seen in our research. We haven't done any studies specifically on the role of private equity, but just anecdotally from the complaints that we see more aggressive billing practices, and the incidence of upcharging, and then combining kind of like upcharging with pushing patients towards financial products that are more expensive for them, is certainly concentrated in private equity owned healthcare practices. And then the only other thing I would add is that we're seeing private equity ownership not only in the healthcare practices, but also in the companies that advise. So like revenue cycle management companies also have a strong private equity ownership model.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing I can add as well is that private equity investment and acquisitions have been a driver of consolidation as well. So a typical a typical model of investment in a specialty where the commercial price matters a lot. So that less so in the nursing home space where there's a lot of public payers, but more so in hospital-based physicians and emergency medicine. A typical model is to buy one large physician practice and then add on smaller competitor practices to consolidate the market, and to also benefit from the highest contracted rate with insurers that the practices you've acquired had. And so if we care about market competition and we're worried about consolidation affecting the quality and cost of care, then private equity investment has not been great.
Okay, in a phrase, what common sense change would y'all focus on today? In a phrase, because we have a minute and a half left.
I mean, I'm kind of a one-trick pony in healthcare, so I would say like 100% financial assistance grants.
All right. Well, we have 1 minute. So
Should we could sit in silence for 1 minute and then give our 10-second answers at the end.
Yeah, there you go. So think about it during this other question, which is, are there any differences between nonprofit and for-profit healthcare entities as far as these problems go?
Do you want to talk about it?
Not as much as you would think, and there's actually been some research that, at least on the financial assistance charity care front, for-profit hospitals are a little better, even though they don't have a legal obligation to do it in most places. So I haven't seen a huge difference unless we factor in the conversation we just had about private equity, because I think that's a different beast. But I actually don't think that there are huge differences between for and nonprofit hospitals. I think that's kind of a sad outcome.
And any last words about these last two questions, Julie, Erin?
Is it fair to say, Eli, then that like the main difference is one is getting a tax break to offer that and the other is not?
Yeah. I mean, the for-profit hospitals don't get the tax break, but I think that they also are more focused on that it's maybe just good business, that pursuing money from people who can't pay it is just throwing good money after bad, whereas the nonprofit hospitals don't have the same incentives.
Yeah, I don't know if this fits with your first question. I don't have a snappy phrase. I'm really not like a snappy phrase person. But I think really focusing on comprehensive looks at healthcare that include the consumer side is really, really important. I think it's part of what we have. Your sign is stressing me out. Is part of what has been lacking, I think, at the federal level in the past. And what I'm really encouraged to see now is that we're working across the different agencies that hold different pieces of this puzzle to get to better reforms.
Please give a round of applause to our wonderful panel.